Big news story trending for almost a week now. The police shooting in Ferguson, Missouri. Today, police released the name of the officer who shot and killed Michael Brown. He's Darren Wilson, a 6-year veteran of the force who had no prior disciplinary action. They also released a surveillance video they say shows the teenager stealing from a convenience store shortly before the deadly shooting. The police chief, Thomas Jackson, was very clear in saying the robbery, quote, was not related to the initial contact between the officer and the teenager. Joining us now to offer insight is Pate. He's a longtime Atlanta trial attorney. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Appreciate it. Thank you. We're studying some of the legal questions in this case, so let's first start with that surveillance video that was released today. Police are saying it shows the victim, Michael Brown, robbing a convenience store before his death.
Right.
We're talking about the timing of the release. An attorney for the family is saying you're trying to assassinate, not you, the police in Ferguson are trying to assassinate the character of the young man who died. What do you make of this decision?
I think they have a very good point. I mean, there's no real purpose to releasing that information because it's not relevant to whether or not the use of force by the officer was appropriate. Because we know from the police chief that the officer that shot Michael Brown was unaware of that robbery. So I think, you know, putting it in the best light possible for the police, it's incidental, it's coincidental, but I actually think it's intentional, and I think it is intended to assassinate his character.
Okay, let's talk about a little bit more about timing. Why release it today? They had the information, you would assume, days ago.
Right. The police chief gave kind of a confusing response on that. Well, I didn't know what to do. Maybe legally we had to under the Open Records Act. But I think the timing of it, at the same time they released the officer's name, may very well and may have been intended to deflect attention away from the officer. You know, media don't focus on this officer, don't start looking into his past, his training records. Look at this tape, because that's what's happening. Media is playing the tape over and over and over again.
Let's talk a little bit more about the officer himself and the investigation that will go into the officer and what happened that night, because that's really the focus here.
Absolutely, it should be. Any federal use of force investigation where there's an allegation of a deprivation of civil rights, what they try to focus on is what was the officer thinking at the time and was it reasonable? An officer can use deadly force if that officer believes that the person who's the target of the force poses an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death to the officer or some third person. So they're going to look at what the witnesses are saying, what the officer is saying, the circumstances of how the gun was discharged, when it was discharged, how many shots were discharged, to determine if the officer's use of force at the time was reasonable.
You said what the officer said.
Right.
He's been questioned
a
number of times. Why haven't we heard his statements?
You know, I think the justification is it's still under investigation, and that's true, but they've released part of the story, and they've released the irrelevant part of the story. So I think the selective release of information is actually harming their argument that we want to be transparent here. So I think they ought to release it.
If federal civil rights charges are filed, when could we see those?
Investigations like this can take many months, sometimes more than a year. But we know in this case, it has the attention of the Attorney General. So if they want to put all of their resources on it. Right. Yeah. And it's a very short window of time that needs to be investigated. So it could happen as shortly as 30 days.
You know, I'll wrap up talking about something that's missing here. We have the thoughts from witnesses. We have the thoughts from the officer. We have surveillance video from the convenience store. We don't have surveillance video from the scene.
That is so unusual. In my experience, 20 years of doing this, these days everyone has a patrol camera in a police car. Almost every department requires it. Some departments even have body cameras on the officer, or at least body mics where you can pick up the audio. I have no idea why this department doesn't have that.
Pate, interesting insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it. Thank you.